Welcome to our ESPAS Trigger ESPAS event on trends and shifts in global governance at the EUI's 2021 State of the Union Conference from Florence. My name is Gaby Umbach. I'm part-time professor at the Global Governance Program of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies and Global Stud Director. I'm delighted to present you first the speakers of today's panel. Jim Cloos. He's Secretary General of TAPSA, the Trans-European Policy Studies Association, Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal Institute Egmont, and board member of the European Policy Center in Brussels. Until January this year, he was Deputy Director General for General and Institutional Policy at the General Secretariat of the Council of the EU. Florence Gaub is Deputy Director of the EU Institute of Security Studies and has previously worked for the NATO Defense College. She's also the lead author of the 2019 ESPAS Global Trends to 2030 report. Andrea Renda is Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Global Governance, Regulation, Innovation and Digital Economy Unit at CEPS, Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, part-time professor of digital policy here at the EUI's School of Transnational Governance, and also visiting professor of the College of Europe, and he's the coordinator of our Horizon 2020 Trigger project. Anthony Teasdale is Director General of the European Parliamentary Research Service and visiting professor at the London School of Economics, European Institute, and at Columbia University. Finally, someone you don't see, but who's very important for us because he's structuring and managing our chat in the back office of the event is Aaron Rosa. He's researcher at the Competence Center Foresight of the Fraunhofer Institute for Systems and Innovation Research. And he's the Trigger lead researcher on scenarios of global governance and the EU's role. So he will be in touch with you when you have questions, and he will group the chat for us. In terms of some housekeeping, down on your screen, right-hand side, you will see the chat box, so the live discussion, and here you can add your questions, and you can also take a poll that three polls actually that we have put there, and can interact with us on this basis to give us a bit of feedback on questions of global governance and Europe's role that we have prepared. Trends and shifts in global governance and the role of the EU. In what regards trends and shifts, there have been a lot in recent years. So just to name some, the erosion and potential renaissance of the global climate change regime, challenges to international agreements like the Iran nuclear deal framework, burden sharing issues over international security governance, new global trade wars emerging, and all of those events have contributed to an increasing contestation of global governance and a trend towards renationalisation of politics in recent years. These trends and shifts go hand in hand with further events that we see impacting on all nation states, which impact on shifts in global power constellations between developed countries and emerging economies, for example, but also related to disruptive technologies or the erosion of liberal democracies around the world. So in short, the world seems on its way towards a new geo-political, geo-economic and geo-technological order. And as we speak, it seems a bit unclear what role of the EU, what role the EU has to play in all of that. Based on research, both from ESPAS and the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System and Trigger, our Horizon 2020 project, this panel will discuss the impacts of these shifts in global governance on the role of the EU to become or to be a global actor and an important global player. Jim, against this backdrop of a seemingly threatening global environment, the EU appears in need to become more resilient, more autonomous, and also more powerful. So basically, that puts strategic autonomy center stage of our discussion. How would you assess this contemporary relevance of the debate on strategic autonomy and the future of strategic autonomy as a trend in global governance?
Thanks very much, Gaby. I will try to give my take on strategic autonomy by answering 6 questions in 5 minutes. Why this debate now? I think you've already answered it. For the EU to survive in a brutal modern world, the EU, not any individual institution, has to become a stronger global player, geo-political actor, if you want to. This requires more strategic autonomy. What is that about? It is about drawing the right lessons from the recent crises and the weaknesses they reveal, becoming more resilient, as you said, more capable to act, more powerful, and yes, more autonomous. I like Daniel Fiott's definition. It's about the freedom to act and the freedom from dependence. What it is clearly not is about protectionism and autarky. For the biggest trading power in the world, that would be like committing suicide to avoid being murdered. It is not either or even about attacking NATO. What lessons are to be drawn from the crisis? The crisis that hit us remind one of Dante's Inferno. Even the smallest sins are viciously punished. And we do have weaknesses, by God we do. They obliged us to find responses on the hoof, as Luc van Middelaar would have said, par une Europe qui improvise. In a way, we practice strategic autonomy the way Molière's Monsieur Jourdain practiced prose without being aware of it. Just a few quick examples of what I mean. Subprime and sovereign debt crisis. They revealed what we knew all along, that there was an imbalance between the economic and the monetary part. They showed that there was too rigid a reading of the no bailout clause and of the ECB's role were a recipe for disaster. So the EU strengthened economic coordination, allowed the ECB to innovate, and created the ESFS and the ESM to help countries in trouble. Migration confronted us with the loss of the control of our external borders. It also showed that Dublin was a fair weather system. The answer was a much more insertive external policy, including a tough deal with Turkey, better control of the internal borders with the help of a beefed up Frontex, and the attempt at reforming the migration and asylum system. We're still trying to do it, but we'll get there. And then finally, COVID crisis, I go straight to the responses. Crisis management measures like green lines, like relaxation of state aids, masks, repatriation, and all of that. The July package, 1.8 trillion, and a joint vaccine procurement. So what does strategic autonomy entail? It is time, in my view, to pass from a reaction, from a purely reactionary phase to a proactive one. For this, we need a better understanding of the modern world. We are rightly proud of being promoters of multilateralism and values, and we should continue doing that. But the end of history is nowhere in sight. We have to adapt to a world that is fierce, brutal, and often hostile. We need a reflection on our exact place on the global chessboard. Where are we between China and the United States? How are we going to relate to Turkey and Russia? What are we going to do in our relationship with the UK, and what will be our transatlantic relationship? We also need a more honest assessment of the right balance between interests and values. And we have to regain the capacity to look at all the angles of our relationship with third countries, not only talking about sanctions. How can we enhance strategic autonomy across policies? Strategic autonomy starts at home. It concerns all our policies. What we need is a thorough analysis of our strengths and weaknesses across major policy fields. Climate change, digital Europe, single market. We have regulatory power, but we have many flaws. External role of the euro, our trade capacity, and of course also security and defense, where we are making some progress. We need a better definition of our relations to NATO. So in my conclusion, I would say that the present debate arose out of necessity. Strategic autonomy is a way to respond to crises and a complicated world. It is about freedom to act and freedom from overdependence. It's not about autarky, protectionism, or anti-NATO. We have been more resilient than what people thought, but we have adapted in a very haphazard manner. We have to now come to a more proactive phase. develop a policy framework with more strategic thinking, a better analysis of our strengths and weaknesses, and maybe also a fresh look at our governance. Finally, I think all of this can be done within the present institutional framework. We don't need major treaty reform. That's the wrong approach right now. If we have to change something in the treaty for health union, we can do it. My final word is that I remain convinced that the EU has the capacity to survive and to reinvent itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Jim, for laying out the backdrop against which we discuss the strategic autonomy question of the European Union. Florence, against these trends and shifts and against the scenery that Jim has just laid out, obviously for what Jim called knowing our place on the global chessboard and entering into strategic thinking about it, we also need to understand which futures we could imagine for strategic planning. So you, as the lead author of the 2019 ESPAS report on global trends to 2030, I think are in an excellent position to talk us through what COVID has changed in your perception on the trends that the EU needs to focus on, and on potentially the futures that we can see for the European Union in global governance. Over to you for that.
Thanks, Gaby. So what's quite interesting about COVID and foresight is that you will remember last year, there was an avalanche of reports immediately assessing that COVID actually didn't change very much and everything, all the trends would just continue as before. And obviously the answer is much more nuanced than that. It's not an either or. A trend is a pattern of change. So that means that even if we have shifts, we will need some more time to see how they're going to unfold. But some ideas, I think, for instances where today I would write the report differently. If you look at 2019 at the report, you will see that we were still mentally a bit more on in the middle ground when it comes to China. We thought maybe there still is a third way possible. And when I say we, I don't mean me and the ESPAS network. I mean, everybody in the EU. I felt, part of the report was basically putting the finger on the pulse of what a lot of people were hoping and thinking. COVID, I think, has really ripped that apart. I think there is no more, like even the agreement that the EU recently struck on trade, it was so negatively received by so many circles that China is now, very clearly marked as a potential opponent, or actually an opponent with very different values, very different visions. And I think the pandemic, China's behavior during the pandemic was key for that insight. So in that sense, COVID did change something. It was not inevitable that we were going to have that relationship with China, but I think we have passed the Rubicon, and the relationship henceforward will be not dissimilar to Russia, not quite as hostile as we're now with Russia, but I think that has definitely changed. There are other things that I think COVID has made clear and has, I think, informed our understanding of these trends. There are digital, health, and climate change. Briefly on digital, I think before COVID happened, we had exaggerated ideas of what digital can achieve. And yes, now we're talking on Zoom, and you and I and everybody in this conversation is a knowledge worker. So for us, Zoom has become the norm. But the reality is, we are just 30%. So our economies, most of the working people do not work or don't have the capacity to move what they're doing online. And I think this is very important insight. At the beginning of the pandemic, people were saying the office is dead. I would say no. COVID has shown that the office is actually gonna survive as the place where people meet. In this case, we actually have learned a lot about what it means to be a human being, how we work, et cetera, et cetera. So I think actually digitalization, while it gave a push generally to COVID, the other way around, COVID gave a push to digitalization, it also showed its limitations. The other thing is health. We warned of this in the Global Trends report, but we felt that nobody was paying much attention to the fact that Europeans were confusing healthcare with health. We have the best healthcare systems in the world, and yet we're not dealing so well with COVID because we're obese, we're smoking too much, we're not moving enough, et cetera, et cetera. I think people have understood now, thanks to the pandemic, that health is your responsibility. It's not just something that you pay for, it's something that we as Europeans as a collective need to take much more seriously. Hence also the call for more responsibility at the EU level, because as you know, health is not something that the EU deals with until now. So I think all of these are really profound changes, but let me finish on climate change, because this is, I think, another topic where people felt the pandemic actually killed our attention when it comes to climate change. Saying that, you know, not enough has been done and we can only focus on the pandemic, not on climate change. But I'm going to offer a different perspective. I think, on the contrary, climate change is left front and center to how we deal with the pandemic. Nobody wanted to take the metro anymore in Paris, and Paris is not the only city that created multiple bicycle lanes now. Paris, Berlin, Bogota, San Francisco. I mean, there's loads of cities that actually became greener as a result of the pandemic, because people, in the absence of restaurants, they want to go to parks, etc., etc. I think that awareness has become very clear. Similarly, meat consumption has gone down. How is that related to COVID? Because people suddenly have to actually do more cooking themselves, go more to the shops, money is down, etc., etc. Renewable energy got a real push, not just in Europe, also in Asia and the United States, because they had privileged access to the grid, etc., etc., etc. And of course, in the EU's recovery program, there's billions, not billions, but millions earmarked for, you know, renewable, for isolation, innovation, etc., etc. So I think actually, at the end of the day, we will have this conversation in 5 years. Climate change will be the key beneficiary of COVID, because while we're already in crisis mode, we finally managed to mentally engage with the other crisis, which we were not capable of doing while we're, you know, seemingly peacefully shipping ahead on the ocean that is whatever history is ahead of us. So I think at the end of the day, we're actually not doing so bad. Things are clearer in 2021 than they were in 2019 at the geopolitical level. Not more peaceful, that's for sure, but I think we now have a much clearer idea of where we are and where we want to go.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Florence. Also for bringing that to the more individual level of the individual citizen, actually, with health awareness, change of attitudes towards food, towards mobility, transport. Anthony, this perfectly links to something that will happen on Sunday. We're actually very close to the inaugural event of the conference on the future of Europe. So within the Brussels debate, participation must indeed be the talk of the town this week. And as we saw this morning, also Ursula von der Leyen referred to that, to the conference in her opening speech. So obviously, we also need to discuss, while reflecting on strategic autonomy, the overall place of democracy in all of that, and the overall place of the citizen in all of that. European Parliament President Sassoli has inaugurated recently 5 focus groups, and one of them for rethinking parliamentary democracy. And yes, one of them is also focusing on the external diplomacy aspect of that. So very much linking to the outside, to the foreign policy element. Coming back to the politics of the pandemic, how do you think that COVID-19 has changed the expectations we have of the European governing system and of parliamentarism and the European Parliament in particular? And what role do you see within the overall global debate is there for parliamentarism to play?
Well, thank you very much, Gaby, and thank you for the invitation to join you on this occasion. It's great to see this event in which the ESPAS process is embedded, because as Florence was kind of alluding to, when the ESPAS process started, which is about 8 or 9 years ago, the assumptions were much more benign about the future of the world, let's put it that way, and the place that Europe would find itself in, that basically the world was going to be more like us. The globalization and the advance of the market were leading to this kind of empowered individual. And that, in a sort of Schumpeterian way, would lead to a greater sort of prospect for liberal democracy, with technology powering that, empowering the individual and probably limiting the role of the state. And now, some years later, we see a rather less benign and a rather more threatening environment. And it's in that context, I think, that the reaction to coronavirus has to be judged, because this isn't just a freestanding development. It comes on top of a pattern of less positive and more threatening developments over time. And of course, the fact that the European Union has been very much at the mercy of crises, some of which have been internally generated, but many of which have unexpectedly come from abroad. Now, having said all that, my perception, for what it's worth, is that the effect on the EU system of the crisis so far has been broadly positive. There are, of course, as Jim was mentioning, there have been some quite serious threats: the threat to free movement, the threat to the single market, the shutting down of competition policy, and depending on your view on the subject of fiscal discipline and the Stability and Growth Pact. But in other areas, the EU has managed to turn this crisis into an opportunity. And I don't just mean there that the own resources are doubled and that the EU's got into the health game. I think rather there is now a much, much greater focus on this whole question of risks, capabilities, and resilience. The notion that there is a freestanding European system, and it needs to be defended, it needs to be developed, and it needs to find its own place in the geopolitical environment. And so, separate to the whole debate about open strategic autonomy or just strategic autonomy, I think this emphasis on risk, capability, and resilience is not only relatively new, but I think it will last, and it will lead to much greater clarity of thinking about where Europe is going, so that Europe is not just a zone of values, it is a zone of interest that need to be defended and advanced. In that context, too, it seems to me that the von der Leyen Commission's agenda, interestingly, has not been significantly knocked off course. One might have expected that the 6 priorities which she set would have seemed overshadowed or undermined or becoming increasingly irrelevant, but far from it. Very much in the way I think that Florence hinted, which is that both on climate change and on digital, their centrality has been reconfirmed. And I think on the climate change front, the argument that was often made, which was that there was never going to be the kind of political capacity or the ability of public opinion to adjust to the scale of the change that's required, is being itself called into question by the scale of the change which people have already brought to bear in their daily lives over the last 12 or 13, 14 months. People see that different futures are possible, different lifestyles are possible, a different way that, if you like, Western capitalism can evolve is possible. And digitization is going to be central to that. And as all generations have had to adjust to a year of living digitally, as it were, as well as dangerously, so I think they understand those issues. They've been taken out of the remit of the technical experts, and they've been placed at the heart of the political system. Having said all of that, and to pick up directly on your question, I do think that parliamentarism is under pressure. There's no doubt about it. This has also been a year in which executive power has grown. I mean, we've seen it grow in autocracies, particularly strikingly, but we've also seen it grow in democracies. It's not entirely clear what place there is for the opposition. It's not clear in a parliamentary system at the moment. It's not clear how much emphasis people can articulate and mobilize around the notion of individual rights in an environment in which the state can so brutally and unilaterally simply change things that people take for granted. And this comes on top of things which have been fragilizing parliaments, the very high turnover that we've seen in parliamentary membership in recent years. And it's not just something in the European Parliament. There was 63% turnover, as you almost certainly know, in the last Euro elections, but in very many national parliaments, we've seen very, very high turnovers in relatively short periods. Even in the United States, where incumbency is often heralded, in a 6-year period, we've seen over half the members of the House of Representatives change. So high turnover has been one factor, and that's come on top of the hollowing out, and perhaps it's a consequence in part of the hollowing out of parties. But the coronavirus crisis has made parliaments more parliaments of strangers, of people who don't meet, who can't commune, who can't form political communities, and aren't able, as easily as in the past, to sort of generate a mood music in the parliamentary environment, which was itself a constraint on the executive and a cue to the media. And I think that's an important part of liberal democracy, which has been eroded. And it's also, particularly in those parliaments with high turnovers, which is most now, led to a parliament of insiders and outsiders, of those who know the ropes because they've been around for a few terms, and those who are new and don't, and aren't really sure what their job is and how to be a successful parliamentarian. And I think it's in that context of a growing sense of a parliament of strangers and of insiders and outsiders that the initiative which you mentioned, which our president in the European Parliament has taken, to have a kind of a bottom-up internal reform discussion finds itself. And that's going to look at a variety of angles, the role of the plenary, parliamentary prerogatives generally in terms of lawmaking and oversight and accountability, communicating with the citizen, parliamentary diplomacy, and some rather more routine matters of internal organisation. But the appetite for that has been really striking. When this initiative was first launched, some of the old lags said, well, you know, we've been around this course many times before. And what's been fascinating is how much enthusiasm has been generated by it. I don't want to overstay my time, as it were, but I would like just to make a further comment, which I think is very important to understand how the EU political system, in my view at least, is developing. I think we're seeing two different EU systems. We're seeing what you might call the policy cycle EU system, which is much more professional. It's based upon the notion that you do ex post evaluation and then ex ante evaluation. You define what the European added value of something is. You send it into the legislature in the normal way. You see the conventional interaction between the EU institutions, and the Commission is extraordinarily powerful in that particular model because of its control over the exclusive right of initiative. And the EU system, the conventional EU system, has been moving firmly in that direction over successive commissions, including this one. This morning there was the annual conference of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, where there was a lot of discussion about this. But there's also the crisis-driven EU model, which exists in parallel and is very much the product of what Alan Millwood, who I think was at the EUI, called the European Rescue of the Nation State, the need of member states to get the EU system in action, not with concessions that they would normally have made, but because only by invoking a European level response is it possible, in fact, to empower the nation state. That has very little room for ex ante or ex post policy analysis. It isn't one that relies upon impact assessment or implementation reports. It's a crisis response, and very often in new areas of policy in which extremely important decisions are made very, very quickly, which can have lasting effect. And that's especially so given the high ambition which this Commission has to be, as Heather Gaby has described it, normative and transformative. That is, it wants to change the way European society and economy evolves over decades and not just over a 5-year term. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Anthony. I'm taking from what you said some points that we will follow up in the discussion: values and interest. And here, I think the impact of the recovery on external dimensions of values is very important. We will take that up. Disruption as a change driver, also important. The last thing you said about events-driven policies, that is new rules-driven policies for the EU, that is the established rule of the game, very much resonates with what Luc van Middelaar has defined recently. So that's what we will come back to. But one thing I want to take up now and ping that to Andrea is what you said about risk capacity and resilience. And I bring in the results from the poll that we had on resilience with the question, can resilience become a new term for global governance? 44% say yes, 33% say potentially, 11 no, and 11 don't know. So quite a bit of optimism there that the global governance could be strengthened by that. Andrea, if we've listened to Jim, to Florence, and to Anthony, and resilience actually was looming there everywhere. Is that something that could become sort of automatic stabilizer for global governance? Is that something where global governance can fill a new term to support the European Union and for the European Union to support global governance?
Thanks, Gaby. Well, this is difficult to say, but I wouldn't say that resilience is going to be a stabilizer at the moment. I think the notion of resilience, whatever, however you define it, because I mean, for example, here we have Florence that I think has worked in a domain that has used the word resilience for much longer than many others that have now started to use it. And we tend to give many, many different definitions, but however you define it, and broadly defining it as the ability of a system to thrive despite adversity and unforeseen shocks, let's say, and so even bordering on the robustness of the system, as sometimes is defined in certain streams of literature. I mean, this is something that is, in my opinion, quite significantly at odds with the way in which we have conceptualized public policy until now, and in the past decades. We come from a wave of Washington consensus that has been dominating in various forms and at the global level, and imposing in many circumstances a less is more approach, a drying out to the bone approach for health systems, for example, for welfare systems, for investments in defense and security to some extent, unless there is a compelling strategic reason. And this has also been reflected over the past decades in what the private sector does, because obviously not only what gets measured gets done, but also what is rewarded on financial markets provides incentives to the corporations. So we've had a globalization of production that has come together with a lack of diversification of global value chains, and a gradual, especially after the financial crisis, a gradual impoverishment of the periphery of those global value chains that have been constantly reaping a very tiny fraction of the value that was created. If you add that the savior of our times, the digital economy, as was said already, has been also responsible for an enormous value capture from the periphery to the center. And these centripetal forces have transformed the already $1 trillion companies into $2 trillion companies in a year. Then you come to a situation in which the world is built on something that is completely different from resilience. And resilience inspires a sense of decentralized governance. Resilience, even in the health literature, requires empowerment of local communities. Resilience requires living in the periphery and living in a decentralized way, the ability to act, the flexibility, the discretion to react to different situations. And this is exactly the opposite of what we've been doing until now. So even our agendas, if you wish, at the global level, have been more successful in those areas where member states could somehow go it alone in a parallel way, rather than really establish plans for pure coordination. I mean, Florence could probably tell us something about what happens in cybersecurity in terms of global cooperation. It's not that this constant ongoing cooperation has been happening in any meaningful way. So what worries me a little bit is also that the resilience focus that will be inevitable over the coming years will also somehow require a refinement of the sustainability focus that we've had until now. Our definition of sustainability typically does not incorporate sufficient attention towards resilience. Perhaps incorporates insufficient attention also for a term that is being used a little bit in the interstitial part in between the two, which is well-being. In my opinion, well, the first risk is that global governance gets a little bit lost into all these different North Stars. You need normally one, but also that the global governance community is unable to translate or to really manage the transition between a form, Anthony was mentioning, approaches to capitalism, a form of capitalism and an approach to capitalism, which is really inward looking for corporations, not even at the value chain level, but really for the corporation itself, and notions that conceptualize the role of the private sector and the public sector as allies towards the greater good, and also towards a very pervasive greater good, including developing countries, including the communities that have been disenfranchised over the past years. So that is, in my opinion, well, the real challenge also at the EU level. At the EU level, we are somehow forced to be the best of breed. We are forced to be leaders. The expectations in the EU are always very sky high. In my opinion, the EU in the coming years should do 3-4 things, and I will just list and then hand over to Gaby. First of all, have more courage in proposing proposing a different approach to capitalism that is not even the stakeholder capitalism, but goes even beyond that, really a genuine European enterprise model. The second thing is to refocus and reconceptualize its approach to global development, which is still disappointing and requires a completely different set of instruments. I think the European Union should also develop new tools to fight is not the right verb, but I mean to engage in the two fronts that are always ever present when the EU acts, which is the internal front, where the EU still needs to justify its existence with citizens. So finding ways to reach out to citizens directly and externally. In the Trigger project, we have analyzed three things, basically. What kind of actor is the EU in the different policy domains? And it's completely different, obviously, depending on whether you look at health or you look at, I don't know, climate. But then after that, how does this actor behave in the global governance space? And the different types of behaviors suggest that the EU is perhaps pretty good at the so-called Brussels effect, meaning inspiring emulation, but it's not very good in negotiations and interactions on the global governance sphere, and that is very important to develop in the future. And the third thing is that actors and their behavior need to be in an environment in which they seize opportunities and manage to really become effective in pursuing their own goals. As a final note, the type of leadership that is expected from the EU is something that has been lacking on two fronts. I think in the first weeks of his presidency, Joe Biden has said two things that the EU could have probably said earlier. First of all, that the time for shareholder capitalism is over. And second, that patents over vaccines could perhaps be temporarily waived. And this doesn't mean that the US can teach us lessons, because as Ursula von der Leyen said this morning, and rightly so, the US has many, many aspects of lack of vaccine solidarity that should be blamed. But I think these are two examples of relatively straightforward leadership that EU institutions could have shown before the US came into play. Thanks, Gaby, over to you.
Perfect, thank you very much. Wow, what a menu to discuss, Andrea, actually. So different approach to capitalism, how to approach development differently, stronger link to citizenship. So actually, to be resilient, the EU needs to change a lot. Jim, I want to bring that back to you. Is that view on resilience still compatible with multilateralism, that the EU actually not uses as an instrument, but as a policy goal, right? And how does that link to strategic autonomy?
I think you cannot make a strict distinction between all of those elements. I was very struck by what Andrea just said about the EU being seen as a leader, being seen as inspiring peoples on values and things like that. That's the way I understood it. But he also said, what about policies and actual cooperation? I think we need to be a model in some ways, but it's not enough. We also need to be a global actor, and quite a tough one from time to time. We have to get a bit nastier from time to time, because otherwise we are preaching in the desert. That is my point. Now, if I say that we need more resilience and we need to develop strategic autonomy, that does not mean that I say we should forsake our values or our approach towards multilateralism. The problem is simply, if we can convince the others to play the multilateral game, fine, let's go for it. But if you have an American president, not this one, the one before, who completely doesn't play the game at all, what are we going to do? Are we continuing to preach? That's not good enough. So my point is, I don't see an opposition between the two. I simply say that if we want to continue to be a model and to defend multilateralism, we have to be stronger. The advantage of the United States after the Second World War was that they had both the kind of moral appeal and the strength, including military. And that's why they were the dominant superpower. We have been quite good because we could do this under the American umbrella for free in a way, to develop our economy, to develop our values, to tell everybody about human rights and about multilateralism, but because we had the United States who were doing the hard work. That's finished. They're not going to continue doing that for us. So we have to emancipate. We have to try and get a bit better at this more power-oriented game if we want to preserve our values. That's my point.
Thank you very much, Jim. I mean, this is a focus on the overall questions of interests and how far the EU can pursue her priorities. Indeed, I'm going now to the chat questions, and I have one interesting question that actually relates to empathy very much. And it asks, shouldn't the pandemic make us better humans and therefore enable us to govern better global migration? Florence, what would you say? Is empathy something that within global governance the EU can put first on the list? Or would you also support Jim's assessment of priorities and interests?
I mean, the question is asked in a normative way. You know, should the pandemic not make us better people? Well, yeah, it should, perhaps, but it probably won't. Because what happens in crisis, from a purely neurological point of view, is that in your brain, you will focus first on what's existential to you, and you will protect that. And we saw that in the early days of the pandemic, when even in Europe, you know, the instinct was, in hindsight, we realized was wrong, bring everybody home, bring all our nationals home. Probably we made it worse, studies say now, because we brought a lot of people back that actually had COVID. But we had this herd instinct, you know, nationals should be in their country, borders up, nobody move. We recovered from that once we had quieted down. So I think the space for empathy will come perhaps at the end of the crisis, because the good news is that when do people actually feel the most optimistic? So I looked at data on optimism, pessimism, etc. And I realized, you know, every so often, even before COVID, we will look at the Eurobarometer and go, ooh, Europeans feel pessimistic. Actually, the data says we don't feel optimistic when things are good. We feel optimistic when things are not good. And so what I can predict with decent certainty is that at the end of this year, maybe early next year, we'll all feel very optimistic because the worst will be behind us. Then, when we feel the pressures off, we can start thinking again about empathy, about, you know, not just empathy amongst ourselves as Europeans, but also to others, etc., etc. But I really don't want to be too hard on ourselves, be it as Europeans at state level or even European citizens. You know, your instinct, wherever you are watching this right now, was to take care of yourself and of your family, and that's what states did at the state level. Later, they recovered; they were able to think also of the other Europeans, etc., etc. But I think the first instinct is just very natural to actually go first and protect what is important to you. It's just how the human brain is wired.
Great, thank you very much. So a very important point for any crisis reaction also of a system to reflect on that, how people and your citizens react. I do have a very interesting question on the democratic element and the Brussels effect, which I would like to pose to Anthony at that point. What is the relationship between the Brussels effect and democratic governance? In other words, can EU regulatory power be utilized to induce democratization abroad, for example, in the Western Balkans?
Well, it's a very interesting question, to which I can't give anything approaching a definitive or necessarily well-informed answer. I mean, it seems to me that the Brussels effect is a fascinating phenomenon, though there is a risk that once it's been kind of invented or discovered, that it's rather like the Heisenberg effect, that your very capacity to acknowledge it diminishes its actual existence, because a lot of people around the world who weren't previously consciously aware that they were de facto or de jure adopting EU technical standards, and that was a kind of political issue, and now sensitized to that. So we may find in retrospect that the era of EU regulatory power in that sense has kind of peaked, and the recognition of the Brussels effect is a sort of time-lagged consequence of the assertion of that power. Having said that, I mean, what it exposes is that, just as I was mentioning that you've got two different EU political systems, you've got two different sets of policies in most democratic systems where the attitude on the part of the general public to how far they want to be actively involved in the management and definition of those policies is rather different. Many of the areas where the Brussels effect has been traced, not all, but many of them, are in areas which are technically rather complex, and ones in which traditionally civil servants or independent regulatory bodies or judicial panels or whatever have had the capacity to define, and therefore it's been possible for a global system to evolve under the radar screen without it being politically very controversial. But of course, issues move between that sphere and spheres which are much more politicized. We've seen that in relatively recent years in trade policy. I mean, if you go back 25 to 30 years ago, trade policy was very much the preserve of national civil servants. Now it's a hugely controversial and neuralgic area of policy difference. And so once that occurs, of course, both the potential for the Brussels effect is diminished, but also the opportunity for democratic participation is enhanced. I don't feel that fully answers the question, but that's how I conceive the issues, as it were.
Thank you very much. And I want to take up something that we discussed earlier, which is the value base again. Andrea, put that to you. What would you say is the impact of the EU's post-COVID recovery on the capacity of the EU to have a value-based foreign policy? So will we be able to put the same importance on conditionality in trade agreements, on the sustainable development mainstreaming in trade agreements, or will we need to compromise because we need to cooperate with countries and blocs that potentially today we wouldn't necessarily pick as our main trading partners?
That's difficult to say, and I'd leave to short-term foresight, if you wish. But it is important to realize that the EU will be under pressure in the coming years, because the way in which we spend the recovery and resilience funds might end up being very different in the different member states. So this might cause divergence inside the European Union, and thereby internal tensions that may reverberate in the ability of the EU to bring its model outside, and also to focus on a clear direction towards sustainability and resilience, which is the current double logic that we see in its policies. At the same time, at the global level, many developing countries will be in need of help because of debt restructuring needs. They entered into the pandemic with very high levels of debt, many of them, and they now will need to be helped. And this will be a very important test bed for the EU in showing the ability to not only to express solidarity, not only to work on aid, but also in particular to generate value at the local level and create the preconditions for a polycentric world where even the developing countries, in the least developed countries, are bringing and building their own abilities to thrive. And that is, in my opinion, what might change in the way in which the EU pursues its values on the global sphere, not imposing conditionalities, but establishing cooperation paths. I think that this is more important. Obviously, as Jim was saying, sometimes you need to be tough, and I totally agree with what he said. We need to be better at playing the power game, but at the same time, the EU is too often seen as being still on a sort of a colonial power, especially in Africa. And if we don't solve that problem, I think this will not even the attempt to introduce conditionalities would not become successful in the future.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We have 1 minute 50 left. Spitfire round to all of you. One thing that the EU needs to focus on to become a resilient actor of global governance in the future. Jim, you first. Your mic. Yep.
The Brussels effect will not work if we no longer have an industry. So we have to develop our industry, then the Brussels effect works. It's not the other way around.
Perfect. Thank you. Florence.
It's a really tricky question. I would say get your priorities right. I think we're trying to do too many things at the same time and be good at everything. Just get your priorities straight, I would say. And to me, that at the moment is strategic sovereignty.
Super, thank you. Anthony?
I would say here I'm more optimistic than Jim, or perhaps I'm more naive than Jim. I would say take advantage fully of the Biden moment. This is the opportunity to defend Western values and interests, and we should be prepared to take risks in that process in the same way as Biden himself is taking risks by providing very authoritative leadership.
Great, thank you. Andrea?
I think the EU should focus on coherence. Many of the values and the priorities are still pursued in a very patchy way. And it's normal for such a complex project, and it's such a lovely project, but coherence is still far from being achieved.
Perfect, thank you. So summarizing that, dare to be EU in a way, also abroad. Thank you very much to all the excellent speakers. It was such a joy to be with you on that panel and to listen to you. As always, too little time, too many questions, and I do hope that we will see each other very soon to discuss all of that. Thank you very much for listening in. Thank you also for our moderator of the chat, Aaron, for having prepared all of that. I want to thank the participants for having been with us and having discussed with us, and stay tuned for the next events today and tomorrow at the State of the Union in Florence. Thank you very much for joining. Thanks. Ciao, ciao.